Alright, what is up YouTube? This is Joe Kempsey, and today I'll be teaching you guys how to play chess in under 10 minutes. So basically the game of chess is played by two players. One player has the white pieces, and the other player has the black pieces. The way it works is that white always moves first, and then black moves, and then white moves, and then black moves, and it just keeps alternating turns up until the end of the game. So now let's take a look at how all the pieces move and how the board is set up. So first, you have your pawns. They kind of form a wall in front of all the other pieces, and the way that they move is up to 2 squares forward on the first move, and after that they can only move 1 square forward. And the thing about pawns is that they cannot move backward, and another thing about pawns is that at the end of the board you can actually be promoted into a queen, so as pawns get further down the board they are generally considered to be stronger. And then in the corner you have your rooks, and these pieces basically move up, down, left, to right, so in straight lines. Then you have your knights. These move in an L shape, can move in an L upside down, to the left, to the right, it doesn't matter as long as it moves in that L shape. Then you have your bishops, and these move diagonally. You have what's called the light square bishop, because it can only stay on the light squares. Then you have the dark square bishop, and it is called that because it can only stay on the dark squares. And then you have your queen, which is the most powerful piece. So the queen combines both the powers of the bishop and the rook. So it can move up, down, left, and right, as well as diagonally, as many squares as it has available. And then lastly, you have the king, which can move 1 square in each direction. And the goal of the game is to checkmate, or basically trap the enemy king. So basically when the king is threatened, it is in what's called check. Like in this case, the rook is attacking this king, therefore the king is in check. So when you're in check, you have to deal with the check. There's no other way around it. And to deal with the check, there are 3 things you can do. The first is to move away from the threatened square, so this king can move up a square and get out of the check because the rook would then no longer be attacking the king. Here, white escapes the check. The second option is to capture the piece that is threatening the king. This bishop can capture this rook, and thus white is happy because white is now out of check and white can now move one of their other pieces. And the last option is to block the piece threatening the king. And in this case, the bishop can block the rook's path to the king by coming to this square, therefore white is out of check, like this. And basically it is checkmate when there are no ways of saving the king. So when you cannot block the check, when you can't capture the piece that's giving check, and when you can't get out of the check, it is checkmate and you lose the game. And this is basically what a checkmate looks like. So notice how white can't get out of this check because the rook cuts the king off. Notice how white cannot block the check because white doesn't have a piece to block the check. And notice how white cannot capture the piece that's giving check because white does not have a piece that can capture this rook that is giving check. So there are a few special rules in chess, and the first one that we'll take a look at is what's called a stalemate. So white can give checkmate in one move here. Nice and clean checkmate as the black king has nowhere to go, and black is in check. But unfortunately, most beginners will screw this up by placing the queen to either one of these 2 squares. And what this does is basically gives the black king no squares where it can go to. So black cannot move the king, but black also is not in check. So it's black's turn to move, but the problem is that black has no pieces that they can move. So in this case, unfortunately, the game ends in a draw by stalemate. So just make sure that you don't trap the opponent's king like this while trying to give checkmate. The next special rule in chess is called castling. So in this case, you can see the rooks are kind of aimed down at the king's throat. This is not really what you want, but unfortunately this happens quite frequently if you leave the king in the center of the board. Fortunately though, there is a solution where you can tuck your king away nicely in the corner. This is called castling. So you move your king 2 steps to the right and the rook 2 steps to the left. You can actually do this in one single move. And as you can see now, the king is nicely protected by the wall of pawns in front, and the rook can even get into the game easier now, rather than it being stuck in the corner. It normally is not a good idea to push these pawns in front of the king because they form that nice shelter. And lastly, you can also castle on the other side of the board. It's just a bit different, where now you move your king 2 steps to the left and the rook goes 3 steps to the right. The last special rule in chess is called en passant, which is French for in passing. So say you have this white pawn and black decides to push their pawn 2 steps. In this scenario, you can actually cheekily capture the pawn like this onto the square that black skipped. And the final position will look like this. So in chess, pieces are worth points, and you can use the point system to help you when exchanging pieces. So basically the pawns are worth 1 point each. Then you have the knights and bishops, they're worth 3 points each. Then your rooks are worth 5 points each. The queen is worth 9 points, and the king is worth an infinite value because if it gets captured, you lose the game. So knowing this will help you to make smarter decisions while playing chess. Like in this case, white should take the rook for the bishop because the rook is worth more than the bishop. Therefore, this is a winning exchange for white and a losing exchange for black. So now it's time to take a look at what to actually do when starting the game. So to play the opening phase well, it's a good idea to follow these 3 rules. You want to develop your pieces quickly, fight for the center, and bring your king to safety. And the reason why you want to fight for the center, which are these 4 squares here, is because the pieces actually have more squares that they can go to when they're placed in the center of the board. Thus, they have more of an impact, more of an influence on the game. And now I'll show you guys kind of a model opening. So one of the best moves is to push the pawn in front of the king up 2 steps because it fights for these 2 squares in the center of the board. It also opens up the diagonal for the bishop. So let's say black brings out their pawn. Now, generally want to move the knights before the bishops because the knights are slower, but bring the knight to this square and it controls these 2 central squares. Then black brings out their knight. Now we want to bring out our bishop so that we can clear the way for our king to castle so we can get our king to safety as quickly as possible. So we can bring the bishop to this square, attacking the knight, or this square where we put some pressure on the pawn there. So let's say black brings out their bishop now. Let's go ahead and castle the king, and now our king is safe. So after you castle your king, you could then focus on developing your pieces on the other side of the board. You may be wondering why we did not use the queen in the opening as it is the most powerful piece. Well, the problem with bringing it out too early is that it can often get chased around or even stuck and get captured. And there are always exceptions to that. So I'll show you guys after this when the queen can be deadly in the opening and how to defend against your opponent who is aggressive with their queen. But generally in the opening, as long as you develop your pieces, fight for the center, and get your king safe, you're probably doing just fine. So let's say you're playing the black pieces here and white aggressively brings out their queen, attacking your pawn. So in chess, when one of your pieces are attacked, generally it's a good idea to protect the piece that's under attack so that you don't lose it. So in this case, black can defend the pawn with either the knight or the pawn. Let's say black brings out their knight. Here, white will try to trick you by playing this bishop move, which actually threatens a checkmate in 1. So you should play in response this pawn move, which kicks the queen away and prevents the queen from giving checkmate. And if the queen then moves to that square where the knight normally goes to here, then you can bring out your knight to this square and you block the checkmating threat. But let's say you play this innocent knight move. Unfortunately, you just overlook the mate threat and you get checkmated in 4 moves. So the real lesson to be learned from this is to ask yourself, what is your opponent trying to do after every one of their moves? Defend against their threats, and you'll quickly see how much of a better player this makes you become. So after the opening, you have the middle game, and this is really where the tactics and strategies start coming into play. So with that in mind, I'll now show you guys 2 tactical tools that you can use in your very own games. The first is called a pin, and these can be used to restrict enemy pieces. The other important tactical tool is called a fork, where you simply attack 2 enemy pieces at once. And in this case, black cannot save both rooks. So here the knight can fork 2 pieces at once, and white will win the rook since black has to first deal with the check. And here you can see the problem with leaving pieces unprotected. Black will lose the rook to the queen fork, because again, black has to deal with the check first and foremost. So another lesson to learn here is to try and keep your pieces protected so that you don't get forked. Don't worry too much about strategy for now. Your strategy can simply be to make smart exchanges. And after the middle game, there is the end game. At this point, most of the pieces will be off the board, and it usually becomes a race to see who can promote their pawn first and go on to checkmate their opponent for the win. So now that you know the basics, go out there and have some fun attacking your opponent's king. Just remember that your opponent can also attack your king, and don't forget about stalemate.